on my daughter's birthday. I walked into the surgical center where she worked and heard her husband call her a filthy little thief. Through the medication room door, I saw her on her knees, gathering files. She pressed one order into my hand before he returned. It had been filed under her login 11 minutes after the patient died. I appreciate you choosing to spend your time here with me. One small thing before we start. Leave a comment and let me know. Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone in your family that nobody else could see? Yes or no? I read every single one. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The message at its core is what truly matters. The morning I found out what my son-in-law had been doing to my daughter. I was standing in a hallway holding a lunchbox I had packed with her dead mother's recipe. But that hallway came later. The morning started the way most of my mornings started since Faye died, quietly, alone, and earlier than any retired man needs to be awake. I stood at my kitchen counter in Katy at 6:15, slicing turkey breast the way Faye used to slice it. Thin enough to fold, but thick enough to taste. Her handwritten recipe card was propped against the salt shaker, the ink fading at the edges where her thumb had pressed it flat 100 times. Turkey. Roasted red pepper. A single leaf of romaine, and the pickles wrapped separately in foil because she always said the bread deserved dignity. I wrapped them separately. I owed her that much. My name is Eugene Prescott. I am 67 years old. I spent 28 years as a federal healthcare fraud investigator for the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, and I retired 3 years ago. 4 months after my wife Faye passed from pancreatic cancer at 62. She had been an elementary school librarian who believed every book had a right reader and every sandwich had a right way to be made. And she was correct about both. That morning I was making the sandwich for my daughter Leonie's 34th birthday. She worked as a compliance officer at the Lone Star Surgical Center in the Texas Medical Center, a position she had held for 6 years. Hired originally by the man she later married. I had not visited her at the center in over a year. Her husband, Garrett, never made me feel unwelcome. He just made me feel unnecessary. The way certain men do when they want you to know the door is theirs. You spend 28 years learning how people hide the worst things they do. Then you retire. And you convince yourself that skill does not apply to your own kitchen table. I drove 30 minutes from Katy into the medical center with the lunchbox on the passenger seat and Faye's station on the radio playing something I did not recognize. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and wet concrete. I signed in at the front desk, took the elevator to the second floor, and turned left toward Leonie's office. I never reached it. The pharmacy department door was closed but not latched. Through the gap I heard a voice I recognized. And it stopped me the way a hand on the chest stops a man, not with force, but with the understanding that moving forward would change the shape of everything behind him. Garrett Ballard was 41 years old, the chief executive officer of the Lone Star Surgical Center, a man who ran a surgical facility the way certain men run kingdoms they built on paper. Every record, every login, every signature answered to him. I had watched him carve a Thanksgiving turkey with surgical precision and charm my wife's friends with the same hands. And I had never once seen what those hands looked like when they believed no one was watching. I saw it now. My daughter was on her knees. Not because she had fallen, because she had been put there. Leonie Prescott Ballard, 34. The center's compliance officer and my only living child, was kneeling on the pharmacy floor, collecting scattered files, while her husband stood over her with the posture of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. "You are a filthy little thief, Leonie," he said. His voice was not raised. It was calibrated. That is what the board will hear. That is what the judge will hear. And that is what Milo will grow up believing about his mother. Milo, my grandson. 8 years old, and the reason Leonie had not left this man, though I did not know that yet. "Pick them up," Garrett said. "Every page. And when you are done, smile at your colleagues like nothing happened. because nothing did. I stood in that hallway with a lunchbox going warm in my hands and listened to the man my daughter married tell her she would lose her son if she opened her mouth. I had heard threats like that before, in interrogation rooms and deposition transcripts, spoken by men who believed their authority was structural and permanent. I knew what those threats meant. I knew what they cost. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that does not arrive as a thought, but as a physical change behind the ribs, that this was not the first time he had said those words. Something inside me did not break. It rearranged itself into something older and colder, something I had not used in 5 years. I did not step through that door. I did not announce myself. I stood perfectly still and let 28 years of training tell me what to do next. Wait, watch, build the case, and do not let him know you are coming. Garrett walked past me close enough that I could smell his cologne, and he never once looked sideways. He moved down that hallway the way a man moves through a building he owns, shoulders centered, gaze forward. Every step communicating that whatever had just happened behind the pharmacy door was already behind him. His shoes clicked against the tile in a rhythm that sounded rehearsed. I pressed my back against the alcove wall and held the lunchbox against my chest and did not breathe until he turned the corner. Then I looked through the gap in the door and saw my daughter standing up from the floor, straightening her blouse, squaring the files against her hip, the way someone squares a deck of cards before dealing a hand she has been waiting to play. She saw me. There was no surprise on her face, no relief. No tears. No collapse into the kind of scene a father expects when he catches something like that. Leonie looked at me the way an operative looks at an extraction point, with focus, calculation, and a clock running in her head that I could not see. She crossed the hallway in 4 steps. She did not say happy birthday. She did not acknowledge the lunchbox. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, closed my fingers around it, and whispered 3 words. Look at the time. Then she turned, walked back through the pharmacy door, and sat down at her workstation as if nothing had happened. The entire exchange took less than 8 seconds. I know because I counted. 8 seconds. That is how long it takes a daughter to decide her father is the only person left she can trust, with something that could destroy her. I walked back to the elevator. I walked through the lobby. I signed out at the front desk with a hand that did not shake because I would not allow it to shake. The woman behind the counter said, "Have a nice day, sir." And I said, "Thank you," and pushed through the glass doors into the parking garage, where the air smelled like exhaust and damp concrete and something I had not smelled in 5 years, the sharp, metallic edge of a case beginning. I sat in my car with the engine off and unfolded the document against the steering wheel. It was a medication order, printed on Lone Star Surgical Center letterhead, routed through the pharmacy dispensing system, logged under my daughter's credentials. Her name, her employee ID, her electronic signature. A standard post-operative pain management prescription hydrocodone, 10 milligrams, quantity 30. I read the timestamp on the order. Then I read the patient information block at the top of the page. Then I read both again. The patient's recorded time of death was 9:14 in the morning. The medication order was issued at 9:25. 11 minutes. How do you write a prescription for someone who is already dead? And more importantly, why would you need to? I knew the answer because I had spent nearly 3 decades building cases around exactly this kind of arithmetic. A medication order issued after death is not a clerical error. It is inventory justification. Someone dispensed a controlled substance that was never administered to a living patient. And then someone created the paperwork to explain where it went. The prescription does not treat the dead. It covers the living, the person who diverted the drug, or billed for it, or both. And this order was logged under Leonie's credentials. My daughter did not write this prescription. I knew that the way I knew my own handwriting, the way I knew the difference between phase cursive and a stranger's print. Leonie had handed me this document not as a confession but as evidence. She had been watching. She had been collecting. and she had waited for me to show up at her door before she gave me the first piece, because she needed someone who would know what it meant without her having to explain it. She was not just a victim. She was an investigator who had been working alone inside a building controlled by the man she was investigating. And she had just made her first handoff. The lunchbox sat on the passenger seat. Still warm, still wrapped in the foil Faye would have folded the same way. I had come to that building to deliver a birthday lunch. Instead, my daughter had delivered something to me, a timestamp, a dead patient's name, and the beginning of every question I would spend the next month answering. I sat in that parking garage with the document flat against the steering wheel. 11 minutes after a patient's heart stopped. Someone logged in as my daughter and ordered medication that patient would never take. And the only person in that building with the authority to access her credentials without her knowing was her husband. I drove past the front entrance of the Lone Star Surgical Center at exactly the speed limit. The way a man drives when he is trying not to do something he will regret for the rest of his life. The medication order was folded in my jacket pocket. My daughter was still inside that building, sitting at her workstation, smiling at colleagues the way her husband had instructed her to smile. And every cell in my body was telling me to turn the car around, walk back through those glass doors, and put my hands on the man who had put my daughter on her knees. I did not turn around. Every rookie mistake I ever saw in 28 years of federal casework started the same way someone who knew enough to be angry, but not enough to be patient. Anger gets you through a door. Patience gets you a conviction. I had watched good agents burn solid cases because they confronted a suspect 48 hours too early. Gave him time to shred, time to call a lawyer, time to build a story that fit the evidence instead of the truth. I was not going to make that mistake with my own family. I merged onto I-10 westbound toward Katy and let the highway do what highways do, put distance between a man and the thing he wants to destroy, until the distance becomes strategy. The lunchbox sat on the passenger seat. Faye's recipe card was still in the kitchen. The sandwich I had made that morning for a birthday celebration was going warm in its foil. And the celebration had been replaced by something I had not felt since the last time I wore a federal badge. Rage is a lit match, useful for exactly 1 second. After that, it just burns your own hand. I needed something slower. Something that would still be burning 6 months from now, when it mattered. I pulled into my driveway in Katy at 11:40. The house was quiet the way it had been quiet for 3 years, not peaceful, just empty. I set the lunchbox on the kitchen counter next to Faye's recipe card and stood there with my hands flat on the granite and my eyes closed, and I thought about what I knew versus what I could prove. What I knew my son-in-law was threatening my daughter, controlling her movements and using her professional credentials to generate fraudulent medical documents. What I could prove? Nothing. Not yet. One medication order with a suspicious timestamp was a question, not an answer. I needed the pattern behind it, the financial trail underneath it, and the institutional architecture that made it possible. I needed Howard. Howard Mercer was 63 years old and had been my partner at the HHS Office of Inspector General for 19 years before we both turned in our badges. He had retired 8 months before I did. Moved to a house in Spring with a workshop he never used, and a wife who had been trying to get him to take up woodworking since the day he stopped carrying a gun. However, did not take up woodworking. What Howard did was answer his phone on the first ring every single time I called. Because 19 years of partnership does not end when the pension starts. He answered on the first ring now. "I need you to pull everything on a facility," I said. "Lone Star Surgical Center, Texas Medical Center. Billing patterns, personnel changes, incident reports, anything with a federal filing number." Quietly. There was a pause. Not hesitation, processing. Howard had always processed before he spoke. It was the thing that made him the best partner I ever had, and the worst dinner conversationalist Faye had ever seated. "How quiet?" he asked. "You want to know the difference between an angry father and a dangerous one. The dangerous one makes a phone call before he makes a fist. The kind where nobody knows we are looking until we decide they should. Another pause, shorter this time. "This is personal," he said. It was not a question. "It is my daughter's workplace. Her husband runs it, and I found something this morning that I have not been able to stop reading for the last hour. I stopped doing this 5 years ago. Eugene. So did I. But there are skills that do not retire just because you do." I heard him exhale the way he used to exhale before we served a subpoena long. Steady and already committed. "Give me 48 hours, he said. He called back in 40 minutes. He had not started on the billing yet. He had barely opened the first personnel file. But something had already flagged a detail so obvious it should not have survived a routine audit, which meant someone had made sure no routine audit ever reached it. "Eugene," he said, and I heard a chair creak like he had just sat down hard. "How long has your son-in-law been running this place?" Howard arrived at my kitchen door at 7 the next morning, carrying a laptop, a legal pad, and the expression he used to wear when a case was about to get ugly. I had not slept. The question he had asked me, on the phone, "How long has your son-in-law been running this place?" had kept me at the counter until 2 in the morning, turning the medication order over in my hands like a man reading a letter he already knows by heart. I let him in. Poured coffee into Faye's mugs, and sat down across from him at the table where my wife used to set breakfast for 3. Howard opened the laptop and turned it toward me. The screen showed a spreadsheet of system access logs from the Lone Star Surgical Center's electronic health records platform. Timestamps, user credentials, file modification codes, and badge swipe records, all cross-referenced against Leonie's personal calendar entries that Howard had pulled from a shared family account she had never thought to lock. 14 modifications, he said. 5 months. Every single one logged under her name. Every single one made when she was not in the building. He walked me through them one at a time. October 7th. A patient discharge summary altered at 9:15 in the evening. Leonie's badge had swiped out at 5:42. October 19th. A prescription history modified at 11:30 at night. Leonie had been at Milo's school concert, confirmed by a photograph she posted to her private account with a timestamp embedded in the metadata. November 3rd, November 11th, November 29th. December. January. 14 entries across 5 months. Each one a surgical insertion into the record system using my daughter's digital identity while she was provably somewhere else. Whoever is doing this is not just stealing her password, Howard said. He set his coffee down and pressed his index finger against the screen. They are building a case against her. Every edit she did not make is another piece of evidence that says she did. A mirror job. In the old days, that is what we called this kind of operation. You do not forge a signature. You steal the hand that writes it. You make someone's reflection do things the real person never would. And when the audit comes, the reflection is all anyone sees. I had investigated mirror jobs in hospital billing systems in Memphis and Medicaid clinics in Atlanta and a rehabilitation chain in Phoenix that billed the federal government. For patients who had been dead for 6 weeks, I knew the architecture. I knew the intent. And I knew that a mirror job this clean, this sustained, this precisely timed, required one thing above all else: administrative access to the system itself. Show me the network architecture, I said. Howard pulled up a second document. The Lone Star Surgical Center used a tiered credential system, standard user, department head, and administrative override. Standard users could view and enter records. Department heads could modify within their own units. Administrative override could log in as any user in the system without triggering a password reset, without generating a secondary authentication flag, without leaving any trace except the timestamp itself. How do you prove you did not do something when every system in the building says you did? You find the one person who could make the system say it. Admin override, Howard said. No password reset triggered. No secondary authentication flag. That is not a hack. That is a feature only one chair in the building has access to. One chair. The Chief Executive Officer. I already knew. I had known since the parking garage. But knowing and confirming are different animals. And the confirmation sat on that laptop screen like a weight I could feel in my hands. Garrett was not just threatening Leonie at home. He was not just standing over her in the pharmacy, calling her names, making her pick up files from the floor. He was wearing her inside the system, logging in as her, modifying records as her, building a paper trail that would make every federal auditor in the country believe that my daughter was the one committing fraud. He was constructing her guilt the way an engineer constructs a bridge, one beam at a time. Load-bearing, designed to hold. Howard closed the laptop and looked at me across the table. The login pattern is not random, he said. Every modification corresponds to a patient file that was billed after discharge or after death. We are not looking at a domestic abuse case anymore. He tapped the legal pad where he had been writing numbers in the margin, the way he always wrote numbers small, precise, underlined twice. We are looking at fraud, and it is in the millions. Have you ever counted the dead to prove someone was stealing from the living? Howard spent 2 days buried in billing records after that first night at my counter. When he came back on the morning of day 4, he did not bring coffee. He brought 6 printed patient files and spread them across my dining table the way a coroner lays out evidence carefully, evenly, with enough space between each one to let the silence do its work. 6 patients. 6 names. 6 people who had checked into the Lone Star Surgical Center for procedures that were supposed to save their lives and did not. That part was not unusual. People die in hospitals. It is the one truth every medical professional learns to carry, and most of them carry it with grace. What was unusual was what happened after they died. Howard pointed to the first file. A 72-year-old woman, knee replacement, cardiac arrest on the table. Time of death recorded at 2:17 in the afternoon. 14 minutes later, a medication order appeared in the system under Leonie's credentials. A post-operative pain prescription that no dead patient would ever swallow. The order generated an automatic dispensing record. The dispensing record generated an invoice. The invoice went to Medicare. The second file. A 68-year-old man, gallbladder surgery, pulmonary embolism in recovery. Imaging referrals logged under Leonie's name 3 hours after his heart stopped. Billed to a private insurer. The third. The fourth. The fifth. The 6th. 6 people died in a hospital. That is not unusual. What is unusual is when someone decides their deaths are worth more than their lives ever were. 3 years, Howard said. He had his reading glasses on and his legal pad open to a page covered in numbers, each one underlined twice in his careful hand. The pattern starts 22 months after Garrett took over as CEO and runs through last month. Each individual claim was small enough to slide under the standard audit threshold, a few thousand here, an imaging referral there. A pharmacy charge that looks routine if you are not comparing it to a death certificate. Total? I asked. $3.2 million. The number sat between us on the table like something with weight. I had investigated fraud cases larger than that in my career. I had seen schemes that ran into the tens of millions. But I had never sat at my own dining table and heard that number attached to my son-in-law's name and my daughter's stolen credentials. The invoices went to Medicare and 2 private carriers. Howard continued. The reimbursement payments did not go back to the surgical center's operating account. They went here. He turned the laptop toward me and pointed to a name on the screen. Meridian Health Advisory. No employees, no office, no website. Just a bank account that had swallowed $3.2 million without making a sound. The company was registered in Delaware, a state where you can incorporate a business with less paperwork than it takes to register a dog. Howard had pulled the filing. Its registered agent was a corporate service address in Wilmington. It had no staff directory, no client list, no public presence of any kind. It existed for exactly one purpose: to receive money and make it disappear. The incorporation date, Howard said, tapping the screen. Look at it. I looked. Meridian Health Advisory was incorporated on March 14th, 2 years ago. Now look at this. He slid a printout across the table. It was a press release from the Lone Star Surgical Center announcing the appointment of Garrett Ballard as Chief Executive Officer. The date on the release was February 28th of the same year. 2 weeks. The shell company was created exactly 2 weeks after Garrett took the job. That is not a coincidence. That is a business plan. He had walked into the building with the fraud already designed, the structure already built, the exit already mapped. The surgical center was never a hospital to him. It was a machine, and he had been feeding it dead patients and harvesting insurance payments since the day he sat down in the corner office. I have not confirmed the bank account signatory yet, Howard said, but I will. I stared at the 6 names lined up on my dining table like headstones. 6 people who trusted a hospital to care for them, billed for services after they were beyond receiving any. Their insurance payments routed into a company that existed only on paper. And every dollar of it had been channeled through my daughter's login, making her the one person in the building who would take the fall if anyone ever looked. Garrett had not just stolen money. He had built a cage around my daughter and furnished it with her own name. The thing about being hunted by someone smart is that they do not come at you with a weapon. They come at you with paperwork. I had spent 4 days staring at billing records and shell company filings, building a picture of a man who had turned my daughter into a scapegoat for millions in stolen insurance payments. But the fraud was only one wall of the cage Garrett was building. The second wall arrived on day 6, in the last place I expected to find it, my own doctor's office. I had a routine blood pressure check scheduled that afternoon at the Galleria. I almost canceled it. The dining table was still covered in patient files, and Howard was running down the shell company's bank records. But I went because Faye had made me promise years ago that I would never skip a checkup. And breaking promises to dead wives felt like the kind of thing that accumulates interest. Dr. Nora Embry had been my primary care physician for 8 years. She was 54. And the kind of doctor who still looked patients in the eye when she delivered bad news. She checked my blood pressure, noted it was slightly elevated, and then paused with her pen above the chart in a way that told me the appointment was about to change direction. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Your son-in-law's office sent over a request last week. They wanted me to begin a cognitive assessment series and document any signs of age-related decline." She set the pen down. They included a template. I sat on the examination table and felt the paper crinkle under my weight and said nothing for a long time. "A template," I finally said. "Let me tell you what a pre-drafted diagnostic template means in plain language. Someone wrote your medical verdict before the doctor ever looked at you. Someone sat at a desk and decided what your brain was doing and typed it up and sent it to a physician's office on hospital letterhead, existing the doctor to sign it the way you sign a receipt, quickly, without reading the fine print. The request came on Lone Star Surgical Center letterhead," Dr. Embry said, "from the CEO's office. I told them I would need to see you first. I have not filed anything." "Don't," I said. I wasn't going to. I thanked her. She asked if I wanted to talk about it. I told her I did not, which was true in the way that a man standing in a burning building does not want to talk about the fire, not because it is unimportant, but because talking takes time he does not have. I drove home to Katie with my hands tight on the steering wheel and my mind running through every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual conversation I had shared with Garrett over the past year. And what I found when I replayed those evenings made the blood pressure reading Dr. Embry had just recorded look like a resting heart rate. Thanksgiving. Garrett had corrected me twice in front of Leonie's neighbors, once about the year Faye and I bought the house, once about the name of a restaurant we had visited together. Both corrections were gentle, affectionate. delivered with a smile and a hand on my shoulder. "Dad, you told that story last week," he had said. "You sure you're remembering that right?" The neighbors had laughed politely. I had laughed with them. How many dinners had I sat through smiling, while the man across the table was quietly building a case to have me declared incompetent? Christmas Eve. He had asked me the same question 3 times in one evening, what time Milo's school started, and each time I answered. He had nodded slowly and glanced at Leonie with a look that said, "You see, he cannot keep track." I had answered correctly all 3 times. The repetition was not mine. It was his. New Year's. A comment about my driving. A suggestion, made gently, in front of Howard's wife, that maybe I should let someone else handle the long trips. A concerned tone that sounded like love and functioned like testimony. I sat in Faye's old reading chair with a legal pad on my knee and wrote down every instance I could remember. 7 entries in 40 minutes. 7 moments I had dismissed as fussiness or affection or the ordinary friction of an in-law relationship. 7 witnesses who would swear under oath that I was losing my mind. And not one of them would know they had been rehearsed. Garrett did not need poison. He did not need a weapon. He needed one doctor's signature on one piece of paper that said my mind was failing. And he had spent months building the chorus of voices that would make that signature feel inevitable. In 28 years of fraud work, I learned one rule that never failed. Follow the signature, and you will find the person who was too afraid to say no. The gaslighting list sat on my desk, 7 entries. 7 rehearsed moments, but I could not afford to stay angry about it. Anger is a luxury for people who are not building a case. Howard had already moved on to the next layer. And on day 8, he pulled the thread that would give us our first name inside the machine. He had been cross-referencing the fraudulent patient files against the center's prescription dispensing logs, matching every post-mortem medication order to the pharmacist who countersigned it. In a hospital system, a prescription requires 2 validations, the ordering physician or provider, and the dispensing pharmacist, who confirms the medication was released from inventory. The provider's name on all 6 orders was Leonie's stolen credentials. Fabricated entries. But the pharmacist's countersignature was real, and it was the same name on all 6. Vernon Lowe, 56 years old. Head of pharmacy at the Lone Star Surgical Center for 9 years. A man whose legitimate prescriptions showed a normal distribution across business hours, mornings, afternoons, the occasional late shift. But the 6 fraudulent orders told a different story. All between 7 and 9 in the evening, Howard said, turning the laptop so I could see the timestamp column. Every single one. After the day shift leaves. After the floor nurses rotate. After the witnesses go home. A signature after hours is a confession written in slow motion. You just need someone patient enough to read it. Vernon Lowe had countersigned 6 prescriptions for 6 dead patients during a 2-hour window that repeated across 3 years with the regularity of a man punching a clock he wished he could break. That is not negligence, I said. No, Howard agreed. That is compliance. The question is whether he is doing it because he wants to or because he has to. I knew the answer before Howard found the proof. In every fraud case I ever built, the person signing the papers was never the person running the scheme. They were the person who could not afford to refuse. The architect sits in the corner office. The signatures come from the people he has leveraged into silence people with mortgages, licenses, families, and one mistake in their past that someone is holding like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Howard found Vernon's grenade that afternoon. It was buried in the center's internal incident archive, a system that Garrett, as CEO, had administrative access to and that had never been subject to an external audit. In 2019, 6 months after Garrett took over, Vernon Lowe had made a dispensing error. Wrong dosage on a post-surgical pain protocol. A patient had an adverse reaction, not fatal, but serious enough to trigger an internal investigation. The investigation was opened on March 3rd of that year. It was closed on March 19th. 16 days. The file contained an incident summary, a corrective action memo, and a sign-off page. The sign-off page carried one signature: Garrett Ballard, Chief Executive Officer. The incident was never reported to the Texas State Board of Pharmacy. That is how it works. I had seen it in every city I ever worked. A dispensing error that should have ended Vernon's career or, at minimum, triggered a board review. A formal reprimand on his permanent record was quietly filed away in an internal system that only one person controlled. Garrett did not punish Vernon for the mistake. He saved him from it. And in saving him, he purchased something far more valuable than loyalty. He purchased obedience. From that day forward, Vernon Lowe signed whatever Garrett put in front of him, not because he wanted to, because the alternative was a 5-year-old dispensing error surfacing on the state board's desk. His license revoked, his career ended, and his reputation destroyed by the same man who had promised to protect it. Garrett had not bought Vernon with money. He had bought him with silence, the most expensive currency in any institution. Howard set the file down and looked at me across the table. Vernon has been signing whatever Garrett puts in front of him for 5 years, because Garrett holds the one thing that matters more to a pharmacist than money: his license. He tapped the legal pad where Vernon's name was now circled twice in red. The question is not whether Vernon will talk, Howard said. The question is whether we can get to him before Garrett realizes we are looking. I stared at Vernon's signature on the screen, small, cramped, the handwriting of a man whose hand had been shaking for years. We had the billing trail. We had the shell company. We had the digital impersonation. And now we had the man inside the pharmacy who could confirm all of it if we reached him in time. I did not go to the pharmacist first. I went to the woman who booked Garrett's calendar. Because in my experience, the person who schedules the lies usually knows more than the person who signs them. Howard had warned me we were racing against Garrett's awareness. Every day we spent pulling records was a day closer to the moment Garrett noticed a thread was loose. So on day 9, I skipped Vernon Lowe entirely and drove to a coffee shop in Rice Village to meet a woman I had never spoken to before, but whose name appeared on every internal memo, every appointment confirmation, and every document routing slip that had crossed Garrett's desk for the past 6 years. Colleen Stafford was 52 years old. She had been Garrett's administrative assistant since the year he was hired, and she was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived, her back to the wall, her eyes on the door. She had a coffee cup between her hands that she was not drinking from. The shop smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon, and the particular anxiety of a woman who had agreed to meet a stranger and was already regretting it. I sat down across from her and did not order anything. I did not make small talk. I told her what I already knew: the billing irregularities, the pharmacy signatures, the shell company, the stolen credentials, and I watched her face change with each piece of information. Not into surprise, but into relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying something alone and has just heard someone else describe its weight. I am not here to threaten you, Mrs. Stafford, I said. I am here because my daughter is being framed for something your boss is doing. And I think you already know that. She looked at the door one more time. Then she looked at me. I have known for 2 years, she said. I just did not think anyone would ever come asking. 2 years. That is how long a mother will swallow her own conscience to keep her child's past from becoming his future. Colleen told me about her son. He had made a mistake at 17. A theft conviction, juvenile court. The kind of case that gets sealed and expunged precisely because the law recognizes that a boy's worst moment should not define a man's entire life. The record was legally erased. It should not have existed in any accessible form. But Garrett found it. She did not know how. One afternoon 2 years ago, he had called her into his office, closed the door, and laid a printout of her son's sealed record on the desk between them. He told her that sealed did not mean gone. He told her that one phone call to the right person could make that record follow her boy into every job application, every background check, every apartment lease for the rest of his life. And then he told her what he needed. "I have shredded reports," Colleen said. Her hands were wrapped around that coffee cup she had not touched once, holding it the way you hold something when you need your fingers to stop shaking. "I have changed calendar entries. I have deleted emails he told me to delete. I leaked your personal schedule to him. Your doctor's appointments, your visits to Leone, your travel patterns. He used that information to time the things he said about you at family dinners. The gaslighting. The 7 rehearsed corrections. Garrett had not just improvised those moments, he had scheduled them. Using my own calendar as the script. Colleen had been the one feeding him the lines. I should have been angry at her. I was not. I had spent 3 decades interviewing people who had done terrible things under coercion, and I had learned to tell the difference between a collaborator and a hostage. Colleen Stafford was a hostage. "There is more," she said, "but there is one thing I will not do for him. Not for him. Not anyone." "What is it?" She shook her head. "Not yet. I need to know you can protect my son first." I understood. Trust is not a gift between strangers. It is a transaction, and Colleen's price was the only currency that mattered to her, her child's safety. I told her I would find a way. I meant it. She stood to leave, pulling her coat tight even though the shop was warm. At the door, she turned back and said one more thing, quietly enough that I had to lean forward to hear it over the espresso machine and the murmur of lunch conversations. "He is not just planning to take your rights, Mr. Prescott. He is planning to take your grandson. And the paperwork is already drafted." She pushed through the door and disappeared into the Rice Village sidewalk crowd. I sat at that table with her, untouched coffee still warm across from me, and felt something shift in my chest that was not rage and was not fear. It was the sound of a clock starting. I was out of my chair before the door closed behind her. Because a woman who says the paperwork is already drafted and then tries to leave is a woman who knows exactly what is in it. I caught Colleen on the sidewalk. She was walking fast. Her coat pulled tight, her keys already in her hand. I did not grab her arm. I stood in front of her and said 5 words. "Tell me what he filed." She stopped. She looked past me at the coffee shop window and then back at my face. Whatever she saw there was enough. She followed me inside and sat back down at the same table. The same untouched coffee still between us. And she told me everything. "He had me type it myself," she said. "Emergency petition for guardianship. Your name, your doctor's name, a diagnosis you do not have, all formatted for Harris County Probate Court." She described the document the way a secretary describes any filing, precisely, methodically, from the header to the signature line. The petition cited my physician's office as the originating referral for a cognitive evaluation. It referenced documented concerns from family members and associates about my mental acuity. It requested court-appointed conservatorship over my financial and medical decisions on the grounds that I represented a danger to myself and to any minor in my care. The minor in my care was my grandson. "Once it is filed," Colleen said, "the court can appoint a temporary guardian within 72 hours. You would not even need to be in the room." 72 hours. That is how quickly a court can appoint a stranger to make your decisions for you. And you do not even have to be told it is happening. I had seen it in elder abuse cases during my career. Families weaponizing the guardianship system to seize control of an aging parent's assets or autonomy. I knew the mechanism. I had testified about it in federal court. And now it was aimed at me. "When is he filing?" I asked. "Next week. The attorney has it. It is just waiting for a date." I felt the coffee shop contract around me, the hiss of the espresso machine, the scrape of a chair at the next table. The smell of cinnamon that had been pleasant 20 minutes ago and now tasted like something burning at the back of my throat. "There is more," Colleen said. She was not looking at me now. She was looking at her hands on the table, her fingers pressed flat against the wood, the way a person presses their hands when they are trying to keep them still. The custody petition for Milo is attached as a companion filing. Same judge, same hearing, same day. The custody petition accused Leonie of workplace negligence and suspected diversion of controlled substances from the center's pharmacy. It cited her login records as evidence every entry Garrett had fabricated under her credentials. Every post-mortem prescription order, every modified patient file. The document presented my daughter not as a compliance officer who had been framed, but as a healthcare professional who had been stealing drugs and falsifying records for years. Think about that for a moment. One man, one filing, and 3 generations of a family lose everything in a single afternoon. I lose my autonomy, Leonie loses her son, and Milo loses the only 2 people in his life who are trying to protect him, all in one hearing, before one judge, on one day that Garrett has already selected. If both petitions go through, Colleen said, he walks out with your grandson and your signature rights. And Leonie walks out with a criminal referral to the district attorney's office. A criminal referral. Not just custody loss. Not just career destruction. Garrett had designed the filing so that the same evidence used to take Milo away from Leonie would also trigger a criminal investigation into the fraud he himself had committed with Leonie as the named suspect. He would be the concerned father protecting his son from a criminally negligent mother. And she would be the defendant in a case built entirely from records she never touched. I sat across from Colleen Stafford in a coffee shop, where the barista was grinding beans 10 feet away. And I understood for the first time the full architecture of what my son-in-law had built. Not a scheme, a trap, one that would spring shut on me. My daughter and my 8-year-old grandson in the same motion. The guardianship petition neutralized me. The custody petition isolated Leonie. The criminal referral destroyed her credibility. And the companion filing ensured all 3 happened simultaneously. Before anyone could respond to any one of them, unless I moved faster than the filing deadline, there would be nothing left to save. My daughter opened the front door without turning on the porch light. And I knew from that single detail that she had been living in a house where visibility had become a risk. I had driven straight from the coffee shop to West University Place. Garrett was at a conference dinner downtown. Colleen had confirmed his calendar before she left, which gave me a window I could not afford to waste. The legal trap was real. The filing deadline was days away, and I needed to tell Leonie what was coming. But what she told me first made the courtroom threat feel like the smaller danger. She pulled me inside and closed the door quietly. The living room was dim, one lamp on its lowest setting. The house smelled like the lavender diffuser Faye had given Leonie for Christmas 2 years ago. And beneath it something else. The stale air of a home where the windows had not been opened in weeks. Milo was asleep upstairs. I could hear the faint wheeze of his breathing through the monitor on the end table. The sound of an 8-year-old boy whose lungs had never worked quite the way they were supposed to. Milo Ballard was 8 years old and small for his age. He had carried an asthma inhaler since kindergarten. The kind of chronic condition that becomes routine until someone reminds you it is the only thing standing between your grandchild and an emergency room. His inhaler sat on his nightstand every night like a glass of water. Ordinary. Essential. Invisible. Leonie sat across from me on the sofa and spoke in the half-whisper of a woman who had learned to have important conversations below the volume of a baby monitor. "I checked Milo's treatment log 3 weeks ago," she said. "The dosage for his preventive inhaler was correct. It matched what his pulmonologist prescribed. I checked it again yesterday." She paused. "2 entries are different. The numbers do not match." An 8-year-old boy was asleep 1 floor above us, breathing through an inhaler that his mother was now afraid to open. "Which entries?" I asked. "Both from this month. Both altered during my suspension period, when I had no system access to see them or contest them. Someone changed my son's medical records. Dad. And the only people with access to that system are the people in that building. I knew who had access. I knew exactly who had the administrative override to modify any record in the system without leaving a trace. But knowing who changed a record and understanding why were different questions. And the second one led somewhere I did not want to follow. Leonie, I said carefully, are you telling me the records were changed to cover a billing discrepancy? Or are you telling me something else? She looked at the baby monitor on the end table. The green light pulsed with each of Milo's breaths. If they changed the records, she said, what stops them from changing what is inside the inhaler? His refills come through the center pharmacy. From Vernon's department. The room got very quiet. What kind of man uses his own son's lungs as leverage in a custody fight? I had asked myself that question in the car on the way over. And I had told myself the answer was nobody. Nobody does that. But I was sitting in a dim living room listening to my daughter describe the exact mechanism by which someone could. And the man she was describing was not a stranger. He was the father of the boy upstairs. I did not want to believe it. I had spent my career investigating people who did unconscionable things for money. And I had always drawn a private line in my mind between criminals who hurt strangers and criminals who hurt their own families. That line was dissolving now. The way lines dissolve when you hold them up against evidence instead of hope. I have not checked the inhaler yet, Leonie said. If I open it and it is wrong, and Garrett finds out I know, he will file everything tomorrow. The petitions, the referral, all of it. He will take Milo before I can prove anything. Then we do not check it tonight, I said. We get it tested somewhere he notice. She nodded. Her hands were in her lap, pressed together the way Faye's hands used to press together during difficult conversations, not praying, just holding. I drove home that night with the windows down despite the January cold, because I needed to feel something other than what was building inside my chest. My grandson's inhaler sat in a kitchen drawer 20 minutes behind me, and I would not know until a lab confirmed it whether the thing keeping him breathing was the right medication or something that had been changed by the same hands that signed his father's paychecks. The call came at 11:40 on a Tuesday night. And the sound my daughter made before she said a single word told me everything the words could not. I had been sitting at my counter with the lab testing plan spread in front of me, the careful, methodical approach we had agreed on. Get the inhaler tested quietly. Do not alert Garrett. Do not rush. The plan was sound. The plan was patient. The plan was 24 hours too slow. Dad, he can't breathe. Leonie's voice was the voice of a mother whose training had taken over while her heart was collapsing. Controlled, precise, shaking at the edges. The inhaler is not working. It is not working. I have already called 911. Keep him upright, I said. I was already reaching for my keys. Keep talking to him. I am 20 minutes out. I drove from Katy to West University Place in 22 minutes. I do not remember the speed limit. I do not remember the traffic lights. I remember the sound of my own breathing in the car and the way the steering wheel felt under hands that had not shaken in 30 years of federal service and were shaking now. The ambulance was already at the curb when I arrived. The front door of Leonie's house was open, light spilling across the lawn. 2 paramedics were carrying a stretcher down the front steps. And on it was my grandson, conscious, eyes wide, his small fingers gripping the oxygen mask pressed against his face with a strength that no 8-year-old should need to use for breathing. I have spent 28 years reading files about people who were harmed by systems that failed them. I had never been the one running through a hospital entrance with the name of the victim caught in my throat. Leonie rode in the ambulance. I followed in my car. Texas Children's Hospital is 11 minutes from West University Place, and every one of those minutes lasted longer than the entire drive from Katy. I parked in the emergency lot and walked through the sliding doors into the smell of antiseptic and recycled air and the particular silence of a children's hospital after midnight. A silence that is not quiet but held. The way you hold your breath when you are afraid to hear what comes next. The emergency team stabilized Milo with nebulized albuterol and intravenous corticosteroids. I watched through the glass partition as a nurse adjusted the nebulizer mask on his face, and his breathing began to slow from the ragged, desperate gulping that had met me at the ambulance to something that sounded almost human again. Almost normal. Almost like an 8-year-old boy who had simply had a bad asthma attack on a Tuesday night. But it was not a bad asthma attack. 8 years old. 47 pounds. Blue lips in a dark bedroom because someone decided his lungs were an acceptable cost of doing business. The attending physician found Leonie and me in the corridor an hour later. She was carrying Milo's chart and wearing the expression of a doctor who had a clinical question she did not yet have a clinical answer for. His airway response suggests his maintenance medication has not been therapeutically effective for at least several days, she said. The severity of this episode is inconsistent with his documented asthma history. Has anything changed with his prescription or his inhaler device? Leonie looked at me. I looked at Leonie. The answer sat between us like a grenade neither of us could put down in front of a stranger. Nothing we changed, Leonie said. Her voice was flat. But her eyes found mine across the corridor. And in them I saw the confirmation of every fear she had whispered to me in her living room the night before. The inhaler had not malfunctioned. The prescription had not been miscalculated. Someone had altered what was inside the device physically, deliberately, in a pharmacy that answered to one man, and my grandson's body had absorbed the consequences. The attending nodded, made a note, and told us Milo would be kept overnight for observation. She walked back through the double doors. Leonie went to sit beside Milo's bed, and I stood in that corridor, alone, my back against the wall, my hands flat at my sides, and I felt something finish rearranging itself inside me that had started the morning I stood in a hallway with a lunchbox. I stood outside the pediatric ICU at 2 a.m. and watched through the glass as my grandson breathed through a machine because the device meant to protect him had been turned into something else. Leonie sat beside his bed, holding the hand that was not taped to an IV line. And somewhere in this city, the man who did this to his own son was sleeping soundly. Leonie's phone rang at 8 the next morning while she was still wearing the clothes she had slept in beside Milo's hospital bed. And the voice on the other end belonged to Human Resources. Milo was stable. His breathing had settled into something steady and mechanical under the nebulizer, and the color had returned to his face sometime around 4 a.m. I had been standing in the hallway when Leonie took the call, and I watched her expression shift from exhaustion to disbelief to something harder than both. She was ordered to report to the Lone Star Surgical Center immediately. At the front desk, an HR representative informed her she was being placed on administrative leave effective that moment, pending a full internal review of medication handling protocols involving a minor dependent. 2 security guards escorted her to her office to collect her personal items. Her badge was taken at the desk. She was not allowed to access her computer. Leonie called me from the parking lot afterward, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had just been punished for a crime committed against her own child. The suspension letter was pre-typed. "Dad," she said, printed on letterhead. His signature was already on it before Milo even stopped breathing. Think about that. The suspension letter was already printed before the ambulance was called. Garrett did not react to the crisis. He scheduled it. The inhaler was tampered with to trigger an episode. The episode was used to justify a suspension. The suspension would be cited in the custody filing as evidence of Leonie's negligence. Every piece connected to the next, like gears in a machine that had been built months ago and set to run on a timer. Garrett was nowhere visible at the center that morning. He did not need to be. The machinery he had constructed operated without his physical presence. HR followed the letter, security followed the protocol. And my daughter walked out of the building carrying a box of personal items, while the man who had poisoned her son's inhaler sat somewhere out of sight. Watch the trap close. I left the hospital at noon. Milo was being kept for observation, and Leonie was back at his bedside. I drove to Katie and found Howard already at my counter. He had the laptop open. His face told me what was on the screen before I sat down. "I pulled the footage this morning," he said. "The camera near the pharmacy storage. I installed it the first week, when we were still mapping the billing trail. I did not know we would need it for this." He turned the screen toward me and pressed play. The footage was grainy, shot from an angle that captured the pharmacy medication cabinet and the counter beside it. The timestamp read January 8th, 7:14 in the evening. The day shift had ended over an hour earlier. The corridor was empty except for one person. 4 seconds. That is how long it takes to swap one inhaler cartridge for another. That is how long it takes to turn medicine into a weapon. Vernon Lowe walked into the frame carrying a small, white box. He opened the medication cabinet with his department key, reached to the shelf labeled with my grandson's name, and removed the preventive inhaler cartridge. He placed it in the box. From his coat pocket, he produced a second cartridge, unmarked, unpackaged, and set it in the space the first one had occupied. He closed the cabinet. He walked out of frame. The entire sequence lasted 4 seconds. 3 days later, Milo woke up, unable to breathe. "That is not a billing entry or a login timestamp," Howard said quietly. "That is a man on camera tampering with a child's medication. That is a felony." I watched it again. And again. Vernon's hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing things he did not want to do for years, quick, precise. The movements of someone who had learned to perform acts of coercion in the smallest possible window so he could spend the rest of the evening pretending they had not happened. "And the man who ordered him to do it," I said, "just suspended the boy's mother for it." Howard closed the laptop. The kitchen was quiet in a way that felt like pressure, the kind of quiet that exists between a decision and its consequences. "Make 2 copies," I said. "One for us, one for whoever will be issuing the arrest warrant." We had the fraud, we had the forgery, we had the digital impersonation and the coercion trail. Now we had a man on camera, swapping a child's inhaler cartridge 3 days before that child stopped breathing. What we did not have yet was time, because Garrett's filing deadline was still coming. And the only way to stop it was to move faster than a man who had been planning this for years. That evening I sat at Faye's kitchen table and did what I had done at the start of every federal case for 28 years. I made a list of the 3 things that had to happen before anything else could. The video evidence was secure. 2 copies, stored separately. But evidence without legal infrastructure is just information. And information without protection is just a target. Garrett's filing deadline was days away, and I needed to fortify every position he assumed was undefended before he realized someone had been building a counter-operation inside his own perimeter. First, call a family law attorney. Not someone from the medical center corridor. Not someone whose name might cross Garrett's desk through a professional referral chain. I needed someone outside his orbit entirely. Howard had a name from a case we worked in 2014. Ruth Glendon, a family law attorney in the Montrose district who had spent 20 years in custody battles and had never once crossed paths with the Lone Star Surgical Center. I called her at 7:30 that evening and told her I needed representation for my daughter in an emergency custody matter involving potential medical fraud. She listened without interrupting and said she could meet us the following morning. Second, called Dr. Embry. I asked her to formally lock my medical records and flag any future external requests for information. She did it while I was still on the phone. Whatever diagnostic template Garrett's office had sent her was now sealed behind an access wall that would require a court order to breach. Third, call Howard. I needed cameras at Leonie's house front door and the kitchen where Milo's medication was stored. Howard said he could have them installed before Garrett returned from the center that night. 3 phone calls in one evening. That is all it takes to build a wall around the people you love if you know which bricks go where. 2 days later. Vernon Lowe found me. I was in the parking garage near the surgical center, not visiting. just watching the entrance from 3 floors up, mapping Garrett's arrival and departure times the way I used to map the movements of subjects who did not yet know they were subjects. Vernon appeared at my driver's side window like a man who had rehearsed this moment for days and was now terrified that it was actually happening. He was 56 years old and looked 10 years older than that. His hands were shaking. His shirt collar was dark with sweat despite the January chill. He stood in that parking lot with the posture of a man whose spine had been borrowed and never returned. And part of me understood exactly how that happens. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Then talk." He looked over both shoulders. He looked at the stairwell door. He looked at the ceiling like it might have ears. "I swapped the cartridge," he said, "in the inhaler. Garrett told me to do it. He said it was a formulation change, that the pulmonologist had approved a different dosage. I knew that was not true. I knew at the moment he said it, but he had the 2019 file. And he told me if I did not do what he asked, the board would have it by morning." I said nothing. In 28 years of interviews, I had learned that silence after a confession is worth more than any question. "I did not kill anyone," Vernon said. His voice cracked on the word kill. "I just could not stop once started." Every time I thought about walking away, he reminded me what would happen. The board, my license, everything I spent 30 years building. How many patients? Vernon, he swallowed. There might be more than 6. I am not sure. He kept some of the files away from me after the first year. There are records I never saw. More than 6. The number I had been working with for a week might be the floor, not the ceiling. "I need you to put this on paper," I said. "Signed, dated, witnessed." Vernon's face closed like a door. "I cannot sign anything, Mr. Prescott. If Garrett finds out I talked to you, he will not go to the board. He will go to the police, and he will make sure I am the only one they find." He turned toward the stairwell. I did not stop him. You cannot force a frightened man to be brave. You can only make sure the door is open when he decides he has no other choice. But before he disappeared into the concrete stairwell, Vernon muttered one more thing without turning around. Quietly, almost to himself. "He has done this before, you know. At the other hospital? Ask about Dallas. Ask about Dallas." So I did. And what I found there was the blueprint for everything Garrett had built in Houston. I had already noticed the gap in his employment history. 8 months between his departure from a hospital in Dallas and his arrival at Lone Star. However, and I had flagged it early in the investigation, but set it aside while we chased the billing trail. Now Vernon's parting words gave that gap a shape and a reason. Howard pulled Garrett's full employment timeline the next morning and spread it across my dining table. Before Lone Star Surgical Center. Before Houston. Before my daughter. There was Ridgemont Medical Center in Dallas, a mid-sized surgical hospital where Garrett had served as director of operations for 2 years. His departure date was March 2017. His start date at Lone Star was November of the same year. Between those 2 points, nothing. No employer, no professional references, no continuing education credits, no conference appearances. 8 months of absolute silence in a career that had otherwise been meticulously documented. In the medical administration world, Howard said, 8 months of nothing is not a sabbatical. That is a cover-up cooling off. Howard had spent 2 days working the phone. He reached a woman who had been in the HR department at Ridgemont when Garrett departed, no longer employed there. No longer bound by any confidentiality agreement she might have signed. She would not go on record. She would not give her name. But she did not hang up. Here is what a clean separation agreement really means. A hospital decided that its brand was worth more than the next victims Garrett would find. The woman told Howard that Ridgemont had identified discrepancies in post-discharge billing during a routine internal audit in late 2016. Services billed to patients after they had left the facility. Imaging referrals logged for patients who were no longer under care. The pattern was small under the federal audit threshold, spread across enough accounts to avoid triggering automated flags, the same architecture, the same arithmetic, the same method I had been staring at on my own counter for 2 weeks. Except in a different city, with different patients and a different hospital that had made the same choice. They fired him, but they did not report him. Not to the Texas State Board of Health Services, not to the Department of Health and Human Services, not to any regulatory body that might have flagged his name in a national database. Instead, their legal department drafted a separation agreement, Garrett's silence in exchange for a clean departure. No termination on his record. No referral to authorities. No warning to whatever institution hired him next. How many people do you have to let a man hurt before protecting your reputation stops being a business decision and starts being complicity? Ridgemont Medical Center had handed my daughter's husband a clean resume and a proven playbook. He walked out of Dallas with the method perfected, the confidence, and the certain knowledge that the system he was defrauding was also the system that would protect him from consequences. He arrived in Houston 8 months later, married my daughter within the year, and built the entire operation at Lone Star using the same template, except this time, he scaled it. More patients, more money, a shell company to absorb the payments, and a compliance officer he could control from the inside, whose credentials he could steal and whose career he could destroy if she ever got close enough to see what he was doing. Leonie had never been his wife. She had been his firewall. Howard pushed one more document across the table that afternoon. It was a scanned photograph from Ridgemont's 2016 staff directory, a headshot page with names and titles printed beneath each face. Garrett's photograph was there, 3rd row, 2nd from the left. The face was the same, younger, smoother, but unmistakably the same jaw and the same eyes that had stared at me across Thanksgiving tables for the past 6 years. But the name printed beneath the photograph was not Garrett Ballard. It was close. A variation, the kind of adjustment a man makes when he wants to carry his identity into a new city without dragging its history behind him. I stared at that name and felt something in the back of my mind begin to vibrate like a wire being pulled taut across a distance I had not measured in years. I had seen that name before. Not at Ridgemont. I had seen that name before. Not at Ridgemont. Not in Dallas. In a federal case file. One of mine. From 15 years ago. I set the photograph down on the table and looked at Howard. And he saw it in my face before I said a word. Basement, I said, before I said a word. Basement, I said, the filing cabinet. I need to open a box I sealed when I turned in my badge. I went down to the basement at 11 o'clock at night because some part of me already knew what I would find, and the rest of me needed to see it with my own hands before I could believe it. The filing cabinet was against the far wall, behind the water heater, tucked into the corner where Faye used to store her holiday decorations. I had sealed it with packing tape the week I turned in my federal badge, a strip across each drawer. Dated and initialed, the way I used to seal evidence lockers. The tape was yellowed now. 5 years of basement air and Houston humidity. I peeled it away and the adhesive came off in long, reluctant threads. The box I wanted was in the 2nd drawer. Personal copies of case materials, notes, photographs, correspondence I had kept for my own records because 30 years of habit does not end with a retirement party. I pulled the box out, set it on the concrete floor, and knelt beside it under the single overhead bulb. The folder was near the bottom. Case number 2010-HHS-OIG-4417. Stamped in red, closed insufficient evidence, dated November 2010. A healthcare billing fraud investigation targeting a mid-level administrator at a small clinic network in Beaumont, Texas. I opened the folder, and the smell of old paper came up like a season I had forgotten. Inside interview transcripts. Billing analysis printouts. A timeline chart Howard and I had built on a whiteboard and then photographed before we erased it. And a photograph. A staff identification photo, clipped to the front page of the suspect profile. 14 months of work. One witness who broke. one wife who got sick, and a case file I sealed because I told myself I would come back to it, knowing I never would. The man in the photograph was younger, thinner in the face. The hair was darker and cut shorter, but the jaw was the same. The eyes were the same. Those careful, measuring eyes that calculated the value of every person in the room and filed it away for later use. The name printed beneath the photograph was a variation of the name listed under Garrett's picture in the Ridgemont staff directory. Not identical. Close enough. I spent 14 months building that case. We had billing anomalies. We had testimony from a clinic receptionist who had seen the suspect modifying patient records after hours. And we were 6 weeks from a grand jury referral. Then the receptionist recanted. She said she had been mistaken about the dates. She said she could not be certain about what she had seen. I knew she had been pressured. I could hear it in her voice on the phone when she told me she was withdrawing her statement, but I could not prove it. And without her, the case fell below the evidentiary threshold. I filed the closure report the same month Faye was diagnosed. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The world contracted to a hospital room, and a woman I had loved for 37 years. And the suspect in Beaumont relocated, changed positions, and dropped off our radar like a stone into water. Let me tell you what it feels like to hold a photograph of the man who destroyed your daughter's life and realize the reason he was free to do it is because you stopped looking. I reached across the basement floor and picked up the framed family photograph I had carried down from the living room mantel. Last Thanksgiving. Leonie. Milo and Garrett at the dining table. Garrett at the head, carving the turkey with surgical precision, smiling at the camera with the confidence of a man who had never been caught at anything. I held the two photographs side by side under the basement bulb. The case file suspect from 2010 and my son-in-law from last November. Same bone structure, same eyes. 15 years apart, 3 names, 3 cities. Beaumont, Dallas, Houston. And every time someone let him walk the clinic that did not report him, the hospital that traded silence for reputation, the federal investigator who closed the file because his wife was dying. He got better at it. I closed that case because the witness disappeared and my wife was dying, and I told myself there would be another chance. There was not. The next chance was my daughter's wedding, and I did not even know it. I walked her down the aisle and handed her to a man I had been hunting 2 years earlier. And I smiled for the photographs because I had already forgotten his face. I sat on the basement floor at midnight with those 2 photographs side by side and understood that the man I let escape was sitting across from my grandson every Friday night. The case I closed because I ran out of evidence was now generating more evidence than I could carry alone. And the guilt of that failure was either going to paralyze me or fuel what came next. I chose fuel. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the basement until the sun came through the window and put a stripe of light across the 2 photographs still lying side by side on the concrete floor. Then I went upstairs. Because going upstairs meant starting a day I would have to spend knowing that 15 years of my daughter's suffering traced back to a case file I chose to close. I sat at the kitchen table through the morning with the 2010 folder open in front of me and did what I had been trained never to do. I made it personal. I retraced every decision. The witness who recanted under pressure I could feel but could not prove. The request for a case extension I never filed because the evidentiary threshold had dropped below the line. The closure report I signed in November of that year. The same month Faye's oncologist told us the cancer had reached her liver. I could have pushed for a second witness. I could have asked for the extension anyway. Argued the circumstantial pattern, bought another 60 days. Instead, I signed the form and drove to the oncologist's office with my wife beside me. And I chose her over the case. I would make the same choice again, every time, without hesitation. But the cost of that choice was my daughter's life as she knew it. You want to know the heaviest thing a man can carry? It is not regret. It is the arithmetic that shows you exactly how your decision became someone else's suffering. If I had pushed harder in 2010, Garrett would have been flagged in the federal system. His name, his real name, his variations, his fingerprints would have surfaced in every background check for the rest of his career. Ridgemont would have found it. Lone Star would have found it. And Leone would never have married a man whose photograph was already in a federal case file labeled with her father's badge number. I sat with that arithmetic all morning. I let it sit on my chest like a weight I deserved to carry. And then I set it down, not because it stopped being true, but because carrying it any longer would cost my daughter the same thing it cost her 15 years ago. Time. I cannot undo 15 years. But I can make sure the next 15 do not belong to him. I called Howard at noon. I told him about the case file. I told him about the name variation and the photographs. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said the only thing Howard ever says when the math changes. "What do you need?" "I need the federal system to see what I see," I said. "This is not a local fraud case anymore. This is a pattern across 3 cities and 15 years. It needs federal eyes." "I know someone at the regional OIG office," Howard said. "An agent, young but sharp. You trained him." I knew who he meant. I filed that thought and turned to the next problem, Leone. She had not called all day. That was unusual. Since Milo's hospitalization, she had called me at least twice daily, checking in, asking about the evidence, coordinating with Ruth Glendon on the custody defense. By 6 o'clock, I had heard nothing. By 7, I had left 2 messages. By 8, I was pacing the kitchen with a feeling I had not had since the night Milo stopped breathing. At 8:47, my phone lit up with a text message from Leone's number. 2 words, no punctuation, sent at 8:47 from a phone that stopped existing 9 seconds later. "Hurry, Dad!" I called back immediately. The line was dead. Not ringing. Not going to voicemail, dead. The way a line goes dead when the device has been physically powered off or taken from the hand that was holding it. I called again. Dead. I called a 3rd time. Dead. I stood in my kitchen at 8:48 in the evening and stared at those 2 words glowing on my screen, and understood that my daughter had just spent her last 9 seconds of communication telling me the one thing she needed most. Not help. Not evidence, not an explanation of what was happening or who was doing it. Speed. She needed speed. Because the man standing in front of her had just taken the only connection she had left to anyone outside that house. Garrett had sensed it. Something in Leone's behavior. Something in my absence from family contact. Some thread he had noticed pulling loose from the edges of his operation. He had taken her phone. He had closed the perimeter. And the man who did it was the same man I had let walk away 15 years ago because I ran out of time then. I was not going to run out of time again. I drove to Leone's house before dawn. Garrett's car was not in the driveway. Colleen had confirmed he was staying at the center overnight for an early board call. I knocked twice. Leone opened the door, with Milo asleep against her shoulder, a bag already packed at her feet. She did not ask where we were going. She already knew. By 9 o'clock that morning, my daughter and I were sitting in a federal waiting room with a manila folder thick enough to end a marriage and start a prison sentence. Milo was safe at my house in Katy, with Howard watching him. Leone sat beside me, holding the evidence folder against her chest, billing records, shell company filings, pharmacy logs, the camera footage on a USB drive, and I noticed that her hands were steady, even though she had not slept. "You do not have to say a word in there," I told her. "I will do the talking." "No," she said. "He used my login. I need to be the one who explains that." A receptionist led us down a corridor and into a conference room with a long table and fluorescent lights that hummed the way fluorescent lights hum in every federal building I have ever entered. We sat down. We waited. And then the door opened and a man walked in carrying a battered field manual with handwriting in the margins that I recognized. because it was mine. Kieran Farrell was 38 years old, a special agent with the HHS Office of Inspector General. And 12 years ago, he had been the most anxious trainee in my orientation class. I remembered him sitting in the front row, holding a highlighter like a weapon, underlining every sentence I spoke as if the words might disappear if he did not capture them fast enough. He had kept the manual. He had kept my annotations. And he had become the kind of agent I had spent my career trying to build. How do you explain to a federal agent that you let the same man walk free 15 years ago because you ran out of time? You do not explain it. You hand him the evidence and let the work speak for the years you lost. "Mr. Prescott," Farrell said. He shook my hand and then Leonie's with the formal care of a man who understood that the woman sitting across from him was both a witness and a victim. "I have waited 12 years to work a case with you again. I just wish the circumstances were different. We laid everything out." Leonie walked Farrell through the credential theft, how her login was used to modify records during hours she was provably off-site, how the admin override made it invisible, how every fabricated entry pointed back to her name while the money flowed elsewhere. I presented the shell company trail, the pharmacy coercion, the camera footage of the inhaler swap. Farrell listened without interrupting, his pen moving across a legal pad in the same precise shorthand I had taught his class in 2013. When we finished, Farrell set his pen down and said something that changed the shape of the entire investigation. "We flagged Lone Star 6 months ago on a billing anomaly," he said. "Your evidence just elevated it from a desk audit to a criminal investigation. You did not start this case. You armed it." Faye would have liked Kieran Farrell. She always said the best students were the ones who kept the notes. Before I tell you what Farrell said next, before the detail that changes everything, are you still with me? Comment your honest read. A, he is going to arrest Garrett now. Or B, something worse is coming first. Add one reason why. A quick note: some details ahead are dramatized for narrative impact. The core truth is what matters. Farrell formally opened a parallel federal investigation. He explained protective measures. Leonie's cooperation would be documented and distinguished from the fraud itself. Her compliance role would be recognized as the cover it was used for, not the crime it was made to look like. Then he slid the annotated field manual across the table toward me. "You trained me at 26, he said. "Now it is turn." I looked at my own handwriting on a page I had forgotten I ever wrote. Margin notes about interview technique and evidentiary thresholds, scribbled in blue ink during a training session I could barely remember. And I understood that retirement was a word I had been using incorrectly for 3 years. Farrell closed the manual. Then he told us there was one more thing. Garrett Ballard had filed an emergency custody motion that morning. The hearing was in 48 hours, and the federal investigation, no matter how strong, could not outrun a family court calendar. Colleen Stafford arrived at the federal building 40 minutes early, sat in her car with the engine running, and almost drove home 3 times. I was not there when it happened. Farrell told me afterward, and Colleen filled in the rest when she was ready. But the story of what she did that afternoon while Garrett's custody motion was already on a judge's desk and the hearing clock was ticking toward 48 hours is the story of the bravest thing I witnessed in this entire case. And I witnessed it secondhand. She came alone. No attorney, no friend, no one waiting in the passenger seat to tell her she was doing the right thing. She carried a handbag and a resignation letter she had not yet submitted, and the particular stillness of a woman who had made a decision that could not be unmade once she walked through the glass doors. Farrell met her in the lobby. He walked her past security without small talk, led her to the same conference room where Leonie and I had sat that morning, and set a digital recorder on the table between them. "You can stop at any point," he said. "But once we start, the recording runs." "If I was going to stop," Colleen said, "I would not have parked car." She spoke for 2 hours. 7 years of coercion, laid out in the steady, detailed voice of a woman who had been rehearsing this testimony in her head every night for months. waiting for someone to ask. She described falsifying surgical supply orders on Garrett's instructions, inflating quantities, rerouting invoices to accounts she was told never to reference in writing. She described suppressing compliance flags that Leone had raised through proper channels. Flags that should have triggered external audits but instead disappeared into the internal filing system that Garrett controlled. She described leaking my personal schedule so Garrett could time the gaslighting comments at family dinners, matching his performance to my calendar the way an actor matches blocking to a script. 7 years of silence weighs more than any document. Colleen's voice shook, not from fear, but from the sheer mass of what she had been carrying. He told me if I ever talked, he would say I was the one who set it up, she said. And I believed him because he had already done it to Vernon. That was the detail that made Farrell's pen stop moving. Garrett had not just coerced Vernon independently. He had used Vernon's compliance as a demonstration for Colleen, proof that the framing mechanism worked, that a person could be trapped by the same evidence they were forced to create. Vernon was not just a participant. He was a warning. Farrell asked Colleen to identify the login credentials used to alter Leone's compliance reports. She did not hesitate. His, she said, every time. He used her workstation, but his admin override. I watched him do it after hours. He never wore gloves. He never looked nervous. He sat at her desk like it was his own, because in his mind it was. You think you know what loyalty looks like until you watch a woman sign away the only job security she ever had because she could not carry someone else's crime for one more day. Colleen Stafford had spent 7 years being loyal to a man who deserved none of it. And in a single afternoon, she transferred that loyalty to the truth. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was a 52-year-old woman sitting in a government conference room answering questions in complete sentences until there were no more questions left to answer. She signed the final page of her sworn statement at 4:17 in the afternoon. Farrell slid a witness protection information packet across the table. Colleen looked at it, then at the signature still drying under her fingers. And for the first time since she sat down, she exhaled. Then her phone vibrated in her handbag. She reached for it out of habit, the automatic reach of a woman who had spent 6 years answering Garrett's calls within 2 rings. The screen showed 1 missed call. Garrett Ballard. Time stamped 4:15. 2 minutes before she signed. Colleen told me later that she stared at his name on her screen for 11 seconds. Long enough to count every year she had spent being afraid of it. Long enough to feel the weight of the document she had just signed and the weight of the name still glowing on the glass. And to understand that those 2 weights could no longer exist in the same life. Farrell reached across the table and turned the phone face down. He called you 2 minutes after you signed, he said. That is not a coincidence. That is surveillance. Colleen did not pick the phone up again. She left it face down on the table, gathered her handbag, and walked out of the conference room with the posture of a woman who had just set down something she had been holding for 7 years. I learned about Colleen's statement and Garrett's surveillance call within the same hour. No hearing had been scheduled yet, but Garrett was moving like a man who already knew he was being hunted. What I did not expect was how quickly he would shift from hunting to attacking. The process server arrived at Leone's door in West University Place at 6:15 on a Tuesday evening. Leone was in the kitchen with Milo, helping him with math homework while something simmered on the stove. She answered the door holding a spatula in one hand and a worksheet covered in long division in the other. The man on the porch handed her 2 documents, asked her to confirm her name, and left without another word. She called me before she finished reading the first page. He is claiming you have early onset dementia. Dad. Her voice had the controlled tremor of a woman who was holding herself together by listing facts instead of feelings. He attached a letter from a physician I have never heard of. What is the name on the letter? It does not matter. The hearing is in 5 days. I drove from Katy to West University Place in 28 minutes. Milo was in his room with the door closed. and Leonie was sitting at the dining table with both fillings spread in front of her like autopsy reports. I sat down across from her and read them the way I had read 1,000 federal documents in my career. Slowly, completely, looking for the architecture underneath the language. The first filing was the emergency guardianship petition. It cited my age, my retirement, and a letter from a physician whose name I did not recognize, claiming I showed signs of cognitive impairment consistent with early-onset dementia. The letter was formatted on medical letterhead and referenced clinical observations that had never taken place. It recommended immediate court-appointed conservatorship over my financial and medical decisions. How do you explain to a judge that the man requesting custody of your grandson is the same man who has been stealing millions through a shell company when the federal agent investigating it tells you to wait? The second filing was the companion custody motion. It accused Leonie of emotional instability, parental alienation, and suspected diversion of controlled substances from her workplace. Every accusation was built from the fraudulent records Garrett had created under her credentials. The motion requested sole custody of Milo on an emergency basis, pending a full hearing. Garrett had not filed these motions to win custody. He had filed them to buy time. 5 days of courtroom proceedings meant 5 days during which Leonie and I would be defending ourselves instead of building the federal case. 5 days for him to scrub records, pressure Vernon into silence, and relocate whatever assets he had not already funneled through the shell company. The courtroom was not his endgame. It was his escape route. "He is not fighting for Milo," Leonie said quietly. "He is using Milo as a shield." I made 3 phone calls in 12 minutes. Ruth Glendon answered on the second ring. She confirmed she could represent Leonie at the hearing and asked me to have the filings scanned and sent to her office by morning. She had handled emergency custody motions before. She knew the terrain. Howard picked up immediately. I gave him the name of the physician on the dementia letter and asked him to pull everything medical license status, practice history, any connection to Garrett or the surgical center. Howard said he would have it by dawn. Farrell listened to everything I told him, and then said the one thing I did not want to hear. If we arrest Garrett before the hearing, his attorney will argue the federal case is a family vendetta. The judge could see the timing as retaliation. We need to let the hearing happen first. 5 days. That was all the distance between my grandson sleeping in his own bed and a family court judge handing him to a man who had already used him as collateral. "What if 5 days is not enough?" Leonie asked when I hung up the phone. "Then we make it enough." I looked at my daughter across her dining table with the 2 petitions spread between us. 5 days earlier, I had been a retired man sitting alone at a counter where my wife used to make sandwiches. Now I was running a war room from my daughter's kitchen, coordinating a federal agent, a family attorney, and a retired partner against a deadline set by the same man who had married into my family and dismantled it from the inside. 5 days. Garrett had given us 5 days, and every one of them would have to be perfect, because the man who had built a fraud empire on dead patients was now trying to take the only 2 people I had left. I spent the first of those 5 days doing what I had done for 30 years, building a case file. The difference was that this time the defendant was my son-in-law, and the evidence had to survive both a family courtroom and a federal grand jury. Howard showed up at my kitchen door at 9 o'clock that night with 2 boxes of case files, a thermos of black coffee, and the same expression he used to wear before a raid. We did not say much. We did not need to. 19 years of partnership had given us a language that ran on silence and nods and the particular rhythm of 2 people who know exactly where the other one is reaching before they reach. We spread everything across the kitchen table and the dining room floor. Login records in one stack, Colleen's sworn statement in another, the Shell Company Incorporation documents beside the billing anomaly printorts, Vernon's pharmacy logs arranged chronologically against the far wall, the camera footage on a USB drive, labeled and sealed, the 2010 case file from my basement, opened for the first time in 15 years. its contents cross-referenced against the current evidence like a before and after photograph of the same crime committed by the same man in different cities. "This is cleaner than half the files we sent to DOJ," Howard said at midnight, his reading glasses reflecting the kitchen light. Garrett did not even bother hiding the Delaware address. He used his own mailing service. "He did not think anyone was looking," I said. "That is the difference between arrogance and strategy." Faye's reading glasses were still in the kitchen drawer where she left them. I opened it looking for a paperclip at 2 in the morning and had to close it again before Howard noticed. Some drawers hold more than their contents. Howard looked up from the legal pad where he had been writing his index. "You have not built a file like this since 2010, he said. "Your hands are steadier now than they were then." They were. In 2010, my wife was dying, and the case was falling apart, and my hands shook because the world was shaking underneath them. Now the world was still shaking. But I had learned something in the years between, that steady hands do not come from calm. They come from knowing exactly what you are building and exactly who it is for. We finished at 3 in the morning. I drove the completed file to the HHS OIG regional office at 7. Farrell met me in the lobby. He was already on the phone with a federal magistrate's clerk, and the conversation sounded like it had been running for a while. He took the file, sat in the lobby, and read it cover to cover without speaking. 26 minutes. I stood by the window and watched the Houston traffic move through downtown and felt the strange suspension of a man who has just handed the most important work of his life to someone else and must now trust them to carry it. "This is more than enough,"
Farrell said.
"I am calling the magistrate's office now." What do you call it when a retired man builds the case that his own government will use to arrest his grandson's father? Justice is the word most people would use. But standing in that federal lobby at 7:30 in the morning, watching Farrell dial a number I used to know by heart, the word that came to mind was not justice. It was cost. Everything has a cost. This case would cost Garrett his freedom. It would cost Milo his father. It would cost Leonie the life she had built around a man who never existed. And it would cost me the illusion that I could have prevented all of it if I had pushed harder 15 years ago. By noon, Farrell called me at home. A federal magistrate had signed the search warrant for the surgical center and all accounts linked to the shell company. The warrant named Garrett specifically. It authorized the seizure of digital records, financial documents, and physical evidence from his office, his home computer, and every account connected to the Delaware entity. "We execute the morning after the hearing," Farrell said. "Not before. I will not give his lawyer ammunition." The warrant was signed. The evidence was sealed. The execution date was set for the morning after the custody hearing. All I had to do now was walk into a courtroom in 2 days and convince a family court judge that I was not the confused old man Garrett's petition described. While a search warrant with my son-in-law's name on it sat in a federal office 12 miles away, waiting for permission to end everything he had built. The night before the hearing, my daughter sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me she had been lying to me for 4 months. The warrant was signed. The courtroom was 12 hours away. Milo was asleep in the guest room with his inhaler, a new one, prescribed by a physician who had never heard of the Lone Star Surgical Center, on the nightstand beside him. I had thought we were as ready as we could be. I was wrong. Leonie reached into her purse and set a USB drive on the table between us. It was small, black, unremarkable. She placed it the way you place something that has been burning a hole in your pocket for months, carefully, with the particular relief of a person who is finally letting go. "I started recording him in September," she said. Conversations at the center, at home, anywhere he talked about the billing, the shell company, Vernon. I kept the files in a locked cabinet in my office and copied them to this drive the night I sent you that text. 4 months. My daughter had been sitting across from the man defrauding her employer, smiling at him over dinner, tucking their son into bed beside him, and pressing record on a device hidden in her pocket for 4 months. She had built a parallel investigation from inside the building I was trying to take down from the outside. And she had not told me because she did not want me to worry, and because she was not sure she was brave enough to use what she was collecting. I raised a woman who could do that, and I did not know whether to be proud or terrified that she learned it from me. "You taught me how to build a case, Dad," she said. "I just did not tell you I was building one." I plugged the drive into my laptop, and we listened. The first recording was from October. Garrett's voice, clear and unhurried, instructing Colleen to reroute a set of billing codes through the shell company's account. He used the name casually, the way a man uses the name of a tool he reaches for every day. The second recording was from November. Garrett on the phone with Vernon, his tone shifting from collegial to threatening in the space of a single sentence, reminding Vernon what would happen to his license if the dispensing error ever reached the state board. The third recording was from December. Garrett and Leonie alone in his office. His voice was patient, almost gentle. The voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone he considered beneath him. "Those reports go where I tell you they go," he said. "You are compliance in title, Leonie, not in practice." I listened to my son-in-law's voice coming through laptop speakers at 11 o'clock at night, and every word he said was a nail in his own coffin that he had hammered himself. He had not whispered. He had not hedged. He had spoken with the full confidence of a man who believed the woman across from him would never have the nerve to use what she was hearing against him. Faye used to say that Leonie got her stubbornness from both sides of the family. She just never told me that stubbornness could look like a locked filing cabinet and a 4-month secret. I called Farrell on speakerphone. I described the recordings. He asked 2 questions. How many? And was Leonie a party to each conversation? She was. "Texas is one-party consent," Farrell said. "Every recording she made is admissible, in federal court and in family court. Get them to me before the hearing." Leonie and I spent the next 2 hours aligning our evidence timelines. Her recordings matched against my billing analysis, her dates against Howard's login records, her conversations against Colleen's sworn statement. The overlaps were exact. The gaps filled each other. By 1 in the morning, the 2 parallel investigations had merged into a single unified case file that neither of us could have built alone. "We have been fighting the same war from opposite ends," Leonie said. "Time to compare notes." My daughter had been running her own operation from inside the walls of the building, controlled by the man she was investigating. Faye would have called it stubborn. I called it inherited. I walked Leonie to the guest room door at 1:15. She stopped with her hand on the frame, turned around, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen since she was a child, delivering bad news she knew would hurt. "Dad, there is one more recording," she said. "The last one. I made it the night he told Milo that Grandpa was sick in the head and would not be around much longer." I listened to that recording 4 more times before dawn. Each replay, Garrett's voice telling my grandson that his grandfather was losing his mind, that I would not be around much longer. It carved the same groove deeper. By 5, I stopped listening and started dressing. Some recordings you survive by answering them in a courtroom. Harris County Family Court smelled like every courthouse recycled air floor wax, and the faint sourness of people waiting for verdicts that will rearrange their lives. Ruth Glendon met us outside courtroom 4B, litigation bag squared on one shoulder, and gave Leonie a single firm nod. No small talk. The Honorable Marion Hale took the bench at 9 sharp. 61 years old. 19 years presiding over custody disputes in this county. And nothing about her expression invited theatrics. She reviewed the docket without glancing at either table. Garrett sat 12 feet to my left with his attorney, a tall man named Schofield who carried the polished confidence of someone billing $600 an hour. Garrett's posture said he had already won. Schofield opened with a narrative I almost admired for its audacity. He painted me as a grief-stricken retiree whose wife's death had destabilized him, a man who had fabricated fraud allegations to gain custody leverage, Then he introduced exhibits, bank statements, transfer records, a spreadsheet showing fund movements between Lone Star Surgical Center and an account bearing my name. Leonie's hand tightened on the armrest beside me. The documents were good. Whoever built them understood federal audit trails, routing numbers plausible, dates staggered convincingly. But they made one mistake. They backdated a wire transfer to a period when Lone Star's internal audit system had been offline for a server migration. I knew this because I had the migration log. Judge Hale caught it before I did anything. She held up the third exhibit, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked at Schofield. "Counselor, this transfer is dated October 14th, 2023. Can you explain why the originating timestamp reflects a system your client's facility reported as non-operational from October 12th through the 17th? Schofield's pause lasted 2 full seconds. In a courtroom, that is a confession. Ruth stood with the calm of a trial attorney who knows the next 30 minutes belong to her. She introduced counter-exhibits methodically, the authentic Meridian Health Advisory Incorporation documents from Delaware. The dispensing records Vernon had been coerced into altering. Colleen Stafford's sworn affidavit detailing Garrett's pressure campaign. Each document landed on the record like a brick in a wall he could not climb. Then Ruth played the recordings. Garrett's own voice filled the courtroom, directing Vernon to adjust inventory counts, coaching Colleen on what to say if auditors called. And finally, the recording from last night, where he told an 8-year-old boy that his grandfather's mind was failing. Judge Hale removed her glasses. She did not put them back on. Ruth had also filed a motion to dismiss the guardianship petition against me that same morning. The physician whose name was on the dementia letter had no record of ever examining me, and his medical license had lapsed 18 months earlier. Judge Hale set it aside without a second look. Garrett shook off his attorney's hand and stood, addressing the judge directly, something about context, about recordings taken out of order, about a family matter being distorted. The rear doors opened. Kieran Farrell walked in with 2 federal agents, credentials displayed. No satisfaction in his expression. He crossed to the well of the court, presented the warrant to Judge Hale, and turned to Garrett. "Garrett Ballard, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, 12 counts of false claim submission, and obstruction of a federal investigation." Garrett's face did something I had seen before in my career. The instant calculation of a man measuring whether the exit is closer than the officer. It lasted half a second. Then his shoulders dropped and he extended his wrists. Vernon Lowe was in the gallery. I had not seen him enter. He stood as the agents worked and said, in a voice that carried across the silent room, "I will provide a full statement. I should have done it months ago." Judge Hale nodded once and wrote something on her docket sheet. Vernon sat down with the look of a man who had just set down something enormously heavy. The agents guided Garrett toward the center aisle. He walked steadily, chin level, performing composure the way he had performed everything. But as he passed Leonie's row, he leaned close enough that only she could hear, and whispered something. 4 words, maybe 5. I saw her face change. Not fear exactly. Something worse. Recognition. I reached for her hand, but she had already pulled it into her lap. Fingers closed around whatever Garrett had planted like a seed designed to grow in the dark. What does a man do when the person who held his leash for 6 years is suddenly gone? Vernon Lowe answered that question the same afternoon Garrett was arrested. He walked into the HHS OIG regional office in downtown Houston without an attorney, asked for Agent Farrell by name, and sat down in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and federal carpet. I was not there. Farrell told me everything later, and I am telling it now the way he described it precisely, because precision is what closed this case. Vernon was shaking when he started talking. He laid out 6 years of coerced prescription fraud in the order it happened, the 2019 dispensing error that Garrett discovered in a routine audit. The private meeting where Garrett explained what would happen if that error reached the medical board. And every falsified pharmacy log Vernon signed from that day forward. He did not minimize. He did not deflect. He spoke the way people speak when they have rehearsed a confession in their heads for so long that the words come out polished smooth. He told me if I talked, he'd send the 2019 report to the medical board, Vernon said. I believed him because he'd already done it to someone else. Farrell asked the standard question. Dates, amounts, every prescription altered. Vernon reached into the bag he had carried in and pulled out a flash drive. 6 years of copies, every falsified log, every altered dispensing record, every email Garrett sent directing changes. Vernon had kept them in his garage, filed in a fireproof box behind his lawnmower. Not as insurance for Garrett, but as proof of his own coercion. He had been building his own evidence file for years, waiting for the day the leash broke. Vernon Lowe was 56 years old, and he cried in that federal conference room like a man who had been holding his breath for 6 years and finally remembered how to exhale. Farrell let him. Then Farrell handed him a tissue and said, Mr. Lowe, cooperation at this stage will be noted. But I need everything, dates, amounts, every prescription you altered. Vernon wiped his face and said, It's all on the drive. I kept copies because I knew this day would come, and I wanted proof I didn't do it willingly. Farrell called me at 3:14 in the afternoon. I was still sitting in my car in the courthouse parking lot. The engine was off, the windows were down. Houston in late January can be mild enough to sit with the air, and I had not moved since leaving the courtroom because I did not know where to go next. Vernon gave us everything, Farrell said. The case is complete. Your son-in-law is not getting out. I should have felt triumph. I had spent 26 days building this, leveraging every skill from a career I thought was behind me. Instead, I felt the weight of a family that would never sit at the same table again, and a grandson who was about to learn what that meant. I set the phone on my knee and watched a sparrow land on the parking lot curb and take off again. Unburdened by anything. Leonie brought Milo to the courthouse 40 minutes later. She needed to collect paperwork from Ruth Glendon temporary custody filings, protective orders, the administrative machinery that follows an arrest. I met them in the lobby. Milo was wearing his school backpack and holding a juice box, and he looked at me with the calm, watchful expression he had been wearing for weeks, the one that made him look older than 8. There is no training manual for the moment your grandson sees his father in handcuffs. No chapter in any field guide that tells you how to stand in a courthouse hallway and explain justice to a child who just lost half his world. We were walking toward Ruth's office when they brought Garrett through. 2 federal agents, one on each side, moving him toward the holding area at the end of the corridor. Garrett's hands were cuffed in front. His tie was gone. He saw Milo at the same moment Milo saw him. Neither of them spoke. Garrett's steps slowed for half a second, and something crossed his face that might have been grief, or might have been performance. I could no longer tell the difference. Then the agents guided him forward and he was gone around the corner. Milo did not cry. He did not ask questions. He reached down and took his mother's hand, and his grip tightened until his knuckles went white. Leonie looked at me over his head, with eyes that held everything she could not say in front of him. He held her hand all the way to the car, and did not let go until she buckled his seatbelt. Then he looked up at her and said the first words he had spoken in an hour. "Can we go to Grandpa's house?" Leonie called me from the parking lot, and I could hear my grandson breathing in the back seat, steady, quiet. And 8 years old. Milo was asleep in my guest room by 7 that evening, his backpack still on the chair, and his shoes lined up by the door the way Leonie taught him. I stood in the hallway and listened to him breathe, and thought about how a child's steady breathing can sound like the most important thing in the world when you have to spend a month fighting to keep him safe. The sentencing was 2 weeks away. I spent those weeks doing something I had not done in years. Nothing. I cooked breakfast. I drove Milo to school. I waited. The federal sentencing hearing took 11 minutes, and every one of them landed like a door closing on a room I would never have to enter again. It moved faster than most federal fraud cases ever do, Vernon's flash drive. Colleen's testimony. And a 15-year-old case file already sitting in a federal filing cabinet meant the grand jury never had to build a record from nothing. Garrett stood at the defense table in a Navy suit, no tie. His attorney had filed motions for leniency that read like fiction community contributions. First-time offender status. A father's devotion to his child. The judge had read them. The judge was not impressed. The sentence came in 4 counts. Healthcare fraud, wire fraud, falsification of medical records, and endangering a minor through medical negligence. 20 years in federal prison. Medical administration license permanently revoked. Garrett did not move when the number was spoken. He stood the way men stand when they have already calculated the outcome and decided that flinching would cost them something they cannot afford to lose. I had seen that posture before. On the other side of conference tables in federal buildings across 3 states. It never meant innocence. It meant accounting. The judge's statement named Milo. Not by first name, by relationship. The defendant's own child, she said, whose chronic medical condition was directly affected by the pharmacy fraud this defendant orchestrated. She described how the falsified dispensing logs had created gaps in medication tracking for pediatric patients. How an 8-year-old boy with asthma had been caught in the machinery of his father's greed. It was the first time the personal cost had been entered into the federal record. And hearing it spoken aloud in that courtroom made it permanent in a way that my own investigation never could. You want to believe that watching justice happen feels like victory. But when the man in the defendant's chair is the father of your grandson, it feels like surgery without anesthesia. You are grateful for the precision. You are not grateful for the pain. Garrett was led out through the side door. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look for me. I sat in my seat and watched the door close behind him, and felt something settle in my chest that was not relief and not grief, but some third thing that does not have a name. Vernon Lowe's hearing followed that same afternoon. He entered the courtroom in a gray suit that hung looser than it should have, and I realized he had lost weight since the day I first saw him at Lone Star. The judge acknowledged 6 years of documented coercion, reviewed Farrell's recommendation letter noting full cooperation, and delivered the sentence 3 years plus probation. Vernon nodded once. He turned toward the gallery, found Farrell sitting 2 rows behind me, and said quietly, "Thank you for believing me." 3 years in probation. Vernon had traded 6 years of fear for 3 years of accountability, and the expression on his face said he considered it a bargain. He walked out of the courtroom like a man who had finally set down something so heavy he had forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. I thought about Faye sitting beside me in that gallery. The way she would have clasped her hands in her lap and said nothing until we were in the car, and then said everything. I missed her with a sharpness that caught me off guard. The way grief does when you think you have mapped all its edges and it finds a new one. Colleen Stafford's case was called last. She stood when the judge spoke her name, and she stood alone, no attorney beside her, no family in the gallery. The judge's words were brief, and final coercion formally recognized. Record cleared. Employment rights fully restored. Fully exonerated, the judge said. And Colleen closed her eyes for exactly 1 second before opening them again. She walked out of that courthouse the same way she had walked in 7 years earlier. Alone. The difference was that this time, nobody owned the reason she was leaving. She passed me on the steps without a word, and I did not follow. She did not look back. I would not have either. I stood on the courthouse steps in the February air and checked my phone. Leone had sent one message while I was inside. "Milo drew a picture at school today. It's you and him at the kitchen table." He wrote Grandpa's house at the top in red crayon. I drove home from the courthouse that afternoon and found the drawing on my refrigerator door. Red crayon. 2 stick figures at a rectangle that was clearly my kitchen table. And the words Grandpa's house written across the top in letters that leaned sideways like they were running somewhere. I stood in front of it for a long time. Then I made dinner. Leonie walked back into Lone Star Surgical Center on a Monday morning in February, wearing a new ID badge with the same name and a different weight behind it. She called me from the parking lot before she went inside, and her voice had a steadiness I had not heard since before all of this started. "My badge works," she said. "My office is the same. Everything else is different." Different was the right word. The center was operating under federal oversight now, and Leonie's compliance role had been restructured to report directly to the oversight board, not to any CEO, not to any administrator, not to anyone who could hollow it out the way Garrett had. The position he had gutted to hide what he was doing had become the most protected job in the building. Judge Hale had formally restored full custody of Milo the previous week, and the paperwork was filed, stamped, and permanent. That morning, I drove Milo to school. He climbed out of the car with his lunchbox in one hand and his inhaler in the other, and I watched him walk through the front doors, the way I had watched him do it 100 times before. But this time, I understood what I was looking at. That is what normal looks like when you have to rebuild it from the foundation up. A compliance badge is just a piece of plastic with a name on it until you have had it taken, questioned, weaponized against you, and earned back on terms no one can revoke. Leonie earned hers twice. That same week. Farrell called and asked me to come to the regional office. He said Howard would be there. He said to bring nothing. The HHS OIG regional office in downtown Houston looked the same as the day I retired. Same hallway, same conference rooms, same institutional carpet that absorbed every sound except the ones you carried in with you. Howard was already seated when I arrived, his coffee untouched, a manila folder on the table between us. Farrell came in with a second folder and set it beside the first. "The original case file has been updated and cross-referenced,"
Farrell said. He opened the folder and turned it so I could read the cover page. Case 2010-HHS-OIG-4417.
My case. The one I had worked for 14 months and been forced to abandon when jurisdictional limits and a suspect who changed names put it beyond my reach. As of today, it's officially closed. Resolved. I looked at the file. 15 years of carrying a case that everyone else had forgotten. And now it was 2 folders on a conference table with a stamp that said closed. Howard picked up his coffee, took a sip, and set it down. 15 years, he said. You weren't wrong, Eugene. You were just early. He said it like a man who had been waiting 15 years to say it. And I heard it like a man who had been waiting 15 years to believe it. Faye had been the one who told me to let that case go. She said it would eat me alive if I kept carrying it. She was right about the carrying. She just did not live long enough to see me set it down. Farrell shook my hand. Howard clapped my shoulder. We walked out of the building together. 2 retired investigators stepping into February sunlight on a downtown sidewalk. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say that the silence did not already hold. Same time next week for coffee? Howard asked. Same place. Rice Village. He nodded and walked to his car. I stayed on the sidewalk and looked up at the building where my career began 30 years ago and where its final chapter had just ended. I had spent 3 years calling myself retired when what I really was unfinished. Now I was finished, and it felt nothing like stopping. It felt like arriving. I drove home to Katie with the windows down. February air coming through like a season that had finally decided to change. When I pulled into the driveway, Milo was sitting on the front porch with a book open on his knees. He looked up and said, "Grandpa, Mom says we might live here now. Is that true?" I looked down at my grandson on the porch steps and said, "Yes." No conditions, no qualifications, just yes. He nodded like he had expected that answer, picked up his book, and went inside. The screen door closed behind him, and the house already sounded different, fuller. the way rooms sound when they know they will not be empty tonight. The first time I heard Milo laugh without coughing afterward. I was standing at the kitchen window with a spatula in my hand and Faye's recipe card taped to the cabinet door. Saturday afternoon, late February, and my grandson was running across the backyard in Katy like a boy who had forgotten there was ever a reason to be careful with his breathing. No inhaler in his pocket. No pause at the end of each sprint to check his chest. Just a child running in winter sunlight because running felt good. Leonie sat on the porch steps with a coffee mug in both hands and watched him. She did not hover. She did not call out warnings. She watched the way a mother watches when the crisis is over and the ordinary has come back. And she is still learning to trust it. "He hasn't used his rescue inhaler in 11 days, Dad," she said without turning around. 11 days. I stood at that window and listened to the sound I had spent 26 days fighting to protect. An 8-year-old laughing in February. And I let it fill the kitchen the way cooking smells fill a kitchen. Slowly and completely, until there was no room for anything else. I packed a lunchbox that Monday morning with the same hands that had assembled a federal case file 2 weeks earlier. And somehow, the lunchbox felt heavier. Faye's chicken salad recipe. The one she made every year for Leonie's birthday. Same proportions. Same container. Same careful layering of lettuce so the bread would not get soggy by noon. I drove to Lone Star Surgical Center and walked through the lobby carrying it like evidence, which, in a way, it was. Leonie's office was on the 3rd floor. Same room, new nameplate. Federal oversight paperwork covered half her desk. Compliance reports stacked beside audit schedules beside a framed photo of Milo that had not been there before. And beside the photo, dented and empty and never thrown away, sat the original lunchbox. The one I had brought to her birthday. The last normal thing I did before everything changed. I set the new one beside it. "Same recipe," I said. She looked at both lunchboxes on her desk and her eyes went bright. "I kept the old one," she said. "I kept it because it was the last normal thing you did before everything changed." I understood then that my daughter had held onto a dented plastic container for the same reason I had held onto a 15-year-old case file. Because some things are too important to throw away just because they look finished. You spend your whole life being told you see too much, worry too much, trust too little. You hear it from colleagues, from friends, from the woman you love. And then, one January, your grandson cannot breathe, and your daughter cannot leave, and the man responsible is sitting at your dinner table carving the roast. And you realize that seeing too much was never the problem. Not seeing enough was. I drove home through Houston that afternoon, past the HHS OIG building on Smith Street where my career started 30 years ago. Past the courthouse where Garrett stood motionless while a judge read 12 years into the record. Past the coffee shop in Rice Village where Howard and I would sit next Tuesday. Same table, same order. 2 retired men who finally had nothing left to solve. The city moved around me the way cities do, when you are no longer racing against them, patient, indifferent, alive. Faye used to say I saw threats in everything. She was right. But this time, seeing the threat was the only thing that saved our family. I wished I could tell her that. I wished she could see the lunchbox on Leonie's desk, and the bicycle leaning against our garage door, and the boy doing homework at a kitchen table that used to seat 1. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. Milo's bicycle was where he always left it, angled against the garage like it was in a hurry to go somewhere. Through the kitchen window, I could see Leonie moving between the counter and the stove, and I could hear Milo's voice asking a question I could not make out. And I could smell something cooking that smelled like a house where people live. I am 67 years old. I am retired. I am not confused. I am not diminished. And I am not finished. I am a father, a grandfather, and a man who learned that family is safe only when someone is clear-eyed enough to protect it and patient enough to do it right. And to you, listening to my story, Remember this. I spent 30 years reading case files and tracking fraud across state lines. And none of it prepared me for the day the evidence pointed to my own dinner table. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have trusted what my gut was telling me the first time I saw those pharmacy records, instead of giving a man the benefit of the doubt because he married my daughter. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until the people you love are already trapped before you act on what you see. This was never a revenge story in the way people expect. There were no dramatic speeches, no public humiliation for the sake of satisfaction. The real revenge story was quieter than that. It was an 8-year-old boy laughing in a backyard without coughing. A daughter walking back into her office with a badge nobody could take from her again. And a 15-year-old case file finally stamped closed. That is what a revenge story looks like when you do it right. Not with anger, but with patience and evidence and the people who stand beside you when the truth gets heavy. I believe God put me through every one of those 30 years so I would be ready for the 26 days that mattered most. His timing was not my timing, but it was the right timing. If this revenge story meant something to you, if any part of it stayed with you, I would be grateful if you left a comment and told me what moment hit you the hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that protecting your family is never something to apologize for. And if you have not already, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were fictionalized for narrative and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. The lesson